Welcome to IVF This, episode 167, IVF and Openness. Hello, 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 my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well today. Today's going to be a short but sweet continuation of last week's episode about judgment. I feel like I say that they're going to be a short episode and then I lie on myself. So we'll see how long this actually ends up being, but it is a continuation of last week's episode around judgment. So if you haven't listened to that one, listen to that one first before you listen to this, because the concepts or the ideas won't kind of make total sense. I think it's a good standalone episode, but I think you need the background of the judgment episode to really understand what I'm trying to kind of convey and come across. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how judgment and openness are related, but not. And then I'm going to share a story about how your coach was humbled around my judgment versus openness. And then I want to talk a little bit kind of in the middle around openness and boundaries, because it's probably the number one question I get when I talk to my clients about judgment versus openness is, where do boundaries fit in? So I want to give you guys a little bit of an example of what those can look like, why they're important, all of that. So when we talk about judgment and openness, I want you to think of them as two sides of the same coin. They're different ways that we deal with information, that we interact with people, and we make decisions, but they're still connected, right? They're definitely connected. So judgment and openness, I want you to think of kind of the first idea is that opposites attract, right? Judgment closes the door, but openness leaves the door open. So when we judge, we're quick to form opinions, draw conclusions. We're doing that often without taking in all of the information. It's when we're in a place of judgment, it's usually pretty rigid, like deciding something black or white. And it usually means we're maybe not super interested in hearing anything that might change our mind or change our opinions or change our stances. When we're open, or when we're experiencing openness, when we're open-minded, whatever verbiage works for you, being open is all about considering new ideas and perspectives. And I'm going to do an entire episode in the coming weeks on perspective versus perception that I think is going to help also kind of loosen up some of these ideas. But it's more about being curious and willing to explore different angles, different perspectives, which then in turn kind of continue to help us keep an open mind. There's an inherent balance between judgment and open-mindedness, right? I say repeatedly in last week's episode about judgment that judgment isn't inherently a bad thing. It can be very useful when you need to make quick decisions, set boundaries. The trick is to make sure that your judgments are informed and that you can stay open to changing them if new information comes your way, right? That kind of simple delineation. But openness does require some boundaries, right? Being open doesn't mean that you just accept everything without thinking about it, right? Without thinking it through. It's about exploring new ideas while still using good judgment, discernment to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. Judgment and openness alter how we see things, right? So if judgment narrows our views, right? When we're in judgment mode, we tend to see things through a pretty narrow lens. We focus on stuff that backs up our original opinion, also known as confirmation bias. And we miss out or ignore things that really maybe don't fit that view. And openness, on the other hand, kind of broadens our perspective, lets us take a step back and see the bigger picture. It's about looking beyond your first impression and considering different pieces of information before deciding. Judgment and openness have different impacts on our relationships, right? If so, judgment puts up a wall in relationships. Judgment can be a great barrier. It can lead to us being less open to understanding where another person is coming from, leading to more intense misunderstandings and conflicts. Openness, though, can create and help foster stronger connections. When we're open, we're more likely to listen and really try to understand others, which can lead to deeper and more meaningful relationships. Judgment and openness have different impacts on our own mental state, our own emotional state, right? Judgment kind of equals more stress. Whether you kind of can see it for a one-to-one match, being judgmental actually causes us more stress. It often comes with a lot of criticism whether it's criticism towards someone else or criticism towards ourselves, that can weigh on us. Just overall, just weigh on our physical and mental mood, and just how we feel moving throughout the day. Openness tends to lead to less stress. I'm not going to say that it, absolves you of all stress, because that's not really a realistic thing. But openness tends to go hand in hand with feeling more positive, right? With having a more positive outlook. So when we're open, we're not really stuck in this like rigid expectation of how things should be or how we think things should be, which just helps overall reduce our stress and makes us more flexible and resilient. Judgment and openness have different impacts on our personal growth, right? Judgment can keep us in a fixed mindset, when things can go only good or bad, right? That black and white thinking that I talk a lot about on this podcast. So we can miss out on opportunities to learn and grow in that more gray area. Openness is, by definition, fits into a growth mindset. It helps us see changes, challenges, and experiences in a different light, right? To learn how to evolve, pushing us forward instead of keeping us stuck. And then the push and pull, right? So we want to, when we're switching between the two, we can move between being judgmental and being open depending on the situation and how we're feeling. And a lot of times that's all I'm trying to get us to do, is to just be aware when we're sitting in judgment, a little bit more open. So what does it feel like when we're sitting in judgment, right? Sometimes we're going to want to judge. Like, that is a survival adaptation that we have evolved to do. We don't have the same environmental fears, environmental danger that we have had in the course of our evolution. But that doesn't mean that judgment doesn't play an important role in our day-to-day survival, our day-to-day activities, our day-to-day thought processes. The key is just to notice when we're being judgmental and when we're being open, right? The more that we're aware, the more that we can replicate the behaviors and the thought patterns that we want, and maybe curb a little bit more of the thought patterns and processes that we don't want, right? It's just all about creating awareness. That is kind of the whole point of this podcast. And I know I talk about that a lot, but I really want to make sure that that's like my true north. I am in no position to tell anyone how to live or how to experience things. My job is just to show you that there are other ways to think about things, and that you ultimately get to decide how you want to think about them. There's absolutely a place for openness and judgment. And it's, again, our job to understand how judgment and when judgment becomes less than ideal or less than helpful for you, and which is what I covered in the last episode. Now, when I talk to my clients about judgment versus openness, the question of boundaries always comes up, which I think is completely valid. And as a society, as a culture, we're just not great with boundaries at all. Like, either we don't know how to set them, we're not good at maintaining them, or we just don't have a great understanding of what a boundary can look like. So setting boundaries, especially during an IVF journey, is really crucial for maintaining your health, your physical health, and your mental and emotional health, right? IVF is so intense. It's so intense. It's an all-consuming experience. And without clear boundaries, it's so easy for us to feel overwhelmed. A few episodes back, I talked about the window of tolerance. When we don't have good boundaries, our window of tolerance is very narrow, it's very small, and we're almost always going to be outside of that window of tolerance, meaning that we're almost always going to be prone to overstimulation or overwhelm, even when we feel like we're doing a good job balancing, quote unquote, balancing it all, when we don't have that clear boundary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why boundaries matter so much, as well as kind of interlinking some examples of boundaries. So boundaries are really instrumental in protecting your emotional energy. IVF is an emotionally taxing experience, ups and downs, anticipations for each cycle, waiting for results. There's a lot of the roller coaster that we talk about. So by setting boundaries, you can actually protect your emotional energy and avoid getting too, for lack of a better word, drained. Okay. So for instance, you might decide to not engage in every conversation about your fertility treatments, where you are, what's happening next, especially if it's with people who maybe tend to offer unsolicited advice or suggestions, or people who tend to share horror stories, right? My cousin's best friend's personal trainer's mailman had the worst experience in IVF, and their wife nearly went off the rails with all the hormone treatments. You don't need to hear that. And if the person that you're talking to has a tendency to go to those extremes, that's not going to be someone who is in the interest of protecting your emotional energy. And so that's your job. You need to be in the business of protecting your emotional energy. So it can be just as easy as I appreciate your concern, but I'd rather not discuss that right now. Lots of things in this world to talk about. This doesn't have to be one of them. Boundaries can be really helpful in managing information overload, right? So there's a ton of information out there about IVF. Some of it's helpful, some of it's not, right? So setting boundaries can look like setting boundaries around the information that you decide to take in. That is going to help you feel more in control, more empowered, and hopefully less overwhelmed. So for example, you might decide to limit the time you spend reading IVF forums, researching online, engaging in maybe some subreddits or support groups, things like that, in an effort to protect your emotional and mental bandwidth. Staying informed is important. Too much information can lead to confusion and anxiety. So it is okay to set limits for yourself, right? That's a boundary that you would set with yourself. Boundaries can help keep us maintaining healthy, nurturing relationships during IVF. Loved ones, we love them. They might have some strong opinions about our choices, but their well-meaning advice can sometimes add stress. A lot of times can add stress. So by setting clear boundaries, you can keep these relationships supportive rather than stressful. For instance, you could let your family know that you value their support and you love them, and you will keep them apprised of some of the big pieces of information, but you and your partner are going to be the ones making the final decisions about your treatment, the final decisions on how much and what type of information you share, things like that. And boundaries are really important for prioritizing your overall well-being. IVF, for many of us, I won't say all of us because it's not true, but for many of us, for a lot of us, it becomes the center of our life and the center of our focus. But it's important to maintain balance. So setting boundaries for yourself, again, some of these are external boundaries, some of these are internal boundaries. Setting boundaries can help you carve out time and space for aspects of your life that bring you joy and fulfillment, whether that's work, hobbies, social life, whatever. This way, when you set boundaries for yourself within yourself around, when I go out on dates with my partner or when I go have dinner with my girlfriends, we're not going to spend any time maybe talking about where we are in the fertility process. Maybe that's just something that I keep in text conversation with my girlfriends, or, we designate some specific times with my partner or my family to talk about those things. You are allowed to do that. Just because someone broaches the conversation with you does not mean you have to engage or be active in that conversation. Okay? Finding the right balance between being open and maintaining boundaries is a little bit of an art form, right? I had kind of a privilege of being raised by a woman who was not raised around boundaries, who became a social worker and a therapist later in life. And so I kind of got to watch her develop. My beloved mother is the person I'm referring to. I got to watch my mom develop these boundaries. I can remember very clearly, she would tell me as I was growing up and, coming to her with last minute emergencies that were not last minute a week ago when I had found out, but she would say, a lack of proper planning on your part does not necessitate an emergency on mine, which sounds a little bit cold, and it certainly did when I was 12, but I got to see boundaries in action. And, that is a place of privilege that I sit from, but it is important. Boundaries are less of a science, more of an art. It's about knowing when to let new ideas or support in and when to protect ourselves by keeping certain things out. So striking the right balance can look like knowing your limits. Know your limits. The first step is understanding your own limits. Awareness. I just went on a little diatribe earlier in the episode about awareness, but reflect on what makes you feel comfortable and supported and what tends to overwhelm and stress you out. For example, if you find that too many opinions from others can start a cloud of judgment for you, it might be a sign to dial back on sharing details with a wide circle of people. Knowing your limits helps you decide where to be open and where to set boundaries. Be selectively open. Openness doesn't mean you have to be an open book with every single person in your entire life. It's about being selective with whom and what you are open to. Maybe you're open to discussing your IVF journey with close friends who understand what you're going through, but keeping more private with acquaintances or coworkers or things like that. You might even consider different treatment options, but set a boundary when it comes to things that don't align with your values, like how many cycles you're willing to undergo, or whether or not you use donor material or not, adoption or not, right? Those are also examples of boundaries. Clear communication is really important in maintaining boundaries while staying open. So if you decide to keep certain aspects of your IVF journey private, let people know in a firm yet kind way. It's completely possible, I promise. For example, you might say something like, I appreciate your interest, but we're kind of keeping this process to ourselves right now. This is a really tender topic, so I want to keep it private. It's not something I want to discuss out in the open. Those are my words. Take them and use them however you want to in a way that feels true and authentic to yourself. A key aspect when we talk about openness and boundaries is staying flexible. It's important to stay flexible when you adjust your boundaries as needed. It's a dynamic process. IVF is a dynamic process. You're a dynamic person. So what you're comfortable with could change over time, meaning that you could become more comfortable or less comfortable, and that's okay, right? Maybe at the very beginning, you're open to trying different types of treatments, but later on you decide to set a boundary because you're feeling overwhelmed by too many options. Perhaps you start off with sharing with a lot of people and then kind of start shrinking that circle. There's no right or wrong way to do this. It's all about what you feel comfortable with. And then, of course, I always want you to check in regularly with yourself, making sure that your current boundaries are serving you and how they might need to be adjusted. Do you feel like you are you're setting boundaries from a place of being open and a place of love, which is how I always suggest you set boundaries, from a place of love, and particularly if it is in regards to a relationship, no matter friendship, family, or your partner. I want it to always come from a place of love for you and for that person, right? Because if you're trying to engage in a conversation, let's say with your parents, and they're maybe not sharing the most helpful information, or they're asking the most helpful or supportive questions, you can share that. You can set I want to talk to you. I want to be in communication with you. When you talk to me about these things, I become very overwhelmed. It's very stressful. So I'd rather not speak about these things so we can still enjoy talking to each other, right? That is a loving way to set a boundary. Okay, now I promised to share a little bit of an anecdote with you about my own learning about judgment. So this is when I was a baby social worker, and that's what we call ourselves when we're kind of newer to the profession. I had already finished my bachelor's degree. I was working on my master's degree, and I was doing my kind of clinical hours that are required for the master's program. And one of my responsibilities was running a group therapy session with some of my patients. And I had this client, or we, because it was part of my supervisor was also involved. So we had this client that I would describe to my supervisor as very resistant, right? I remember specifically using those words: very resistant, closed off, wouldn't participate, right? Those were kind of my key words when I was talking about this patient and when I would write therapy notes and things like that. And so in one of my supervision sessions, my supervisor asked me, and when you think, this is a very Emily coded question, right? When you think they are very resistant, what happens to you? And so after a long pause, I responded, I think I get frustrated, right? Because when we think someone is resistant or someone doesn't understand, we tend to get frustrated. And she responded with, and what would happen if you noticed that I was getting frustrated with you in this conversation? Another long pause. And I said, I think I would probably shut down. And then she hit me with a 1-2 punch of who is really being the resistant one, which was obviously me, right? Based on their behavior, I had decided that they were resistant and closed off. So in turn, I became resistant and closed off towards that patient, which was not a healthy therapeutic relationship for us. the second of the 1-2 punch was, so that takes me back to, when was the first time in your life that you felt frustrated with someone that didn't get it? And then we had to unpack some family stuff and all that. But that's what we're talking about. Very often judgment, the opposite of openness, right? Judgment is very much a projection of what we have experienced, our own thoughts, our own opinions, our own biases that we are then projecting on someone else. So that kind of closes the loop on the openness versus judgment. I'm going to continue this theme throughout the next few episodes because I do think it's very, very important. I think that because so much information, especially in our current political climate in the US, IVF is a much more discussed topic. And so I feel like the balance between openness and judgment, it maybe if you're going through active treatment right now, you might even be feeling like it's become much more of a political talking point. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep some of these concepts in mind. And as always, we're not using this stuff against ourselves, right? That's the first rule of thought work. We don't use what we come to understand from ourselves. We don't use what we have, the knowledge and the awareness that we've gained against ourselves. That's not the point. The point is to say, oh, I can see, like from my example of my own learning, I can see how my thought process about this patient left me in a position where I was not being a good therapist, where I was not being a good counselor to that patient, right? I wasn't even advocating for that patient, like how they could be more receptive, what supports they might need to be more comfortable or more present during our group therapy. I had just decided that they were resistant and closed off, and that was the end of it, right? So that is thematically something that has gone through my mind in many, many different aspects, whether it's friendships, professional relationships, my own marriage, my relationship with my children. The theme of judgment and openness is always going to be there. So I just want you guys to kind of think about how that works for you and what that can look like. Okay? So that is what I have for you today. I hope you have a beautiful week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.